Coming up today on the Nick Craig Show, more than 6 years since the start of COVID-19, we are seemingly learning more information day by day as to who exactly was making decisions. We've got some new interesting details on Governor Roy Cooper at the time and his decision to keep North Carolina schools closed. We'll have all the details coming up. And a good Thursday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget that you can take the show with you 24/7 on demand in your favorite podcast app. It is a real simple and easy to do. Just search for the Nick Craig Show, tap the subscribe or follow button, and you'll take a new program with you each and every weekday morning. You can also listen online by visiting the website nickcraig.com. Our program this morning brought to you by the Law Group here in Wilmington. For any legal questions or challenges, lawgroupnc.com. We'll hear more from them coming up a little bit later on in the program this morning. It is August 2026, and we go all the way back to March, April of 2020, more than 6 years ago, in some cases 6.5 years ago, with the start of COVID-19. Now, let me be clear. On the program today, I'm not going to go through an entire chronological order of what went on during COVID-19. I don't have the time to do that, and frankly have no interest in rehashing all of the nonsense, all of the garbage, all of the crap that went on during COVID. But in the years that have followed the COVID-19 pandemic, the shutdowns, the garbage quote-unquote advice, medical advice, the scientific advice that we were getting from individuals like Dr. Anthony Fauci, it has become so blatantly obvious and clear to me that nobody had any idea with what was going on. And let me take a step back and say, it's okay not to have all of the answers. This is something that we as humans deal with in a variety of different facets of our lives, day in and day out. It's okay not to have an answer. It's okay to not know definitively whether something is the right decision or wrong decision. And I think generally as humans, we are okay with that. We have some grace with that. We've got some level of confidence that not every decision is going to be made and not every decision is going to be right. However, when you look back at COVID, and especially the early days, or not necessarily the early days, but this more middle period, once we got a few months into COVID-19, I think that's when a lot of criticism from folks, myself included, really starts. At the early onset, when we truly didn't know anything about what was going on, I think the vast majority of the American population, and I'll throw myself in here included, had some level of skepticism as to, well, what is this thing? What is this thing going to mean? Right? But that lasted a relative short amount of time, maybe a couple of months. As we got into the late spring and summer months of 2020, it became obvious that what was going on was not necessarily what was being proposed by individuals like Dr. Anthony Fauci. And that's where the criticism is. If Fauci had gotten up on the national stage, had done an interview and been honest and said, oh, we don't exactly know what's going on here. This is kind of what we're thinking. This is some of the advice we'd recommend. That would have been one thing. But let's make sure we're perfectly clear about this. That's not what happened. An individual by the name of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the head of NIH at the time, stood up on national television day in and day out and proclaimed with 100% certainty that what he was saying, what he was recommending, what he was proposing to the American people was 100% based in solid scientific evidence. And we now know 6 years plus later that wasn't true. The 2 weeks to slow the spread was complete BS. The 6 feet of social distance was not backed up by any scientific, and I mean any scientific evidence whatsoever. Wearing these stupid garbage blue surgical masks did not stop particulates from being spread. They had little to no impact on the spread of COVID-19. That's what sticks with me. Not that we didn't know. Not that there was some level of skepticism. And honestly, it was a very unprecedented event. Let's be perfectly honest. A worldwide, global, quote-unquote, pandemic is not something that we have dealt with since the early parts of the 1900s, 1918 or something like that. It doesn't happen every single year. It doesn't happen every decade. It doesn't happen every 20 or 30 years. This was a very new, unknown thing. But the individuals that we inherently trusted based on their credentials to provide us with fact-based information, to provide us with a path forward that was based in some sort of reality, based in some sort of science, frankly, lied to us. They did. And you might say, well, Nick, that things were unknown at that time. I get that. But that's not what was proclaimed to the American people. The American people were not told by the leading health officials in the United States that there was a high level of uncertainty and they didn't know. No, they stood up on national television, they did interviews, they conducted press conferences and proclaimed to be preaching the gospel, that this was 100% true, 100% fact, 100% based in scientific evidence. And frankly, that was not the case. And so as we got into the late spring, summer months of 2020, and the goalposts had been consistently moved, 2 weeks to slow the spread or stop the curve or whatever it was called at the time. 2 weeks became 2 months. 2 months became 4 months, and then 8 months. And then 2 years later, you look back and go, what did we just do? What just played out in front of our eyes? You've got businesses, people's livelihoods that are being stripped away from them, unconstitutional business shutdowns in states like North Carolina at the hands of the former Democrat governor, now turned Senate candidate Roy Cooper. What was it all based on? It was seemingly, to use a new phrase that all of the kids are using, they were just operating based on vibes. That's all that it was. There was no science to back up this 6 feet garbage. There was no science to back up putting on some low-risk surgical mask was going to stop the spread of COVID-19. There was no evidence that big box stores like Walmart and Costco and Target could operate and were not a playground for COVID-19, but small mom and pop businesses were going to cause you to kill yourself and your family with COVID. There was no scientific evidence in any of this. We now know this to be an absolute fact. When the history books are written, and I hope they are written in an accurate way, COVID-19 should go down as one of the biggest fumbles as it relates to government, not only here in the United States, but across the world, one of the biggest fumbles of government in modern history, because that's what it was. We were not being told the truth. We were not being given information that was accurate. You had people like Anthony Fauci, who we now know through his private diary, was more interested in meeting celebrities, more interested in being on the front of magazines, more interested as being a celebrity than providing accurate scientific evidence to the American people. A man who spent 40 years at the National Institute of Health, who prior to COVID should have had, based on everything he had done in the past, and I know he had some controversies with AIDS and things like that, but a guy that there should have been a significant level of trust with. That trust was very quickly eroded, not because of any other reason that what we were being told wasn't accurate. And God forbid you pushed back on some of the so-called alleged science at the time. You were, of course, a right-wing conspiracy theorist. You looked at peer-reviewed studies that were published that showed the social distancing made no difference, that these stupid blue masks didn't do anything. And God forbid you looked at something like ivermectin, horse dewormer. You're going to go ahead and kill yourself using that. That's what was pushed by the so-called health professionals. It was a very, very dark time, not only in American history, but the history for the rest of the world. We are talking about COVID-19 some 6 years later. The premises of the discussion here today is some new information out of Dr. Anthony Fauci's private diary, where he wrote down all of this various information during COVID-19, all of the conversations that he was having, all of the internal debate that he was having, and seemingly had absolutely no interest in providing some of the private conversations that are very interesting in retrospect, had no interest in providing some of that information to the American people. And here is the issue, as I was already mentioning. When you stand up on that national stage, when you stand on that pedestal and proclaim that what you're saying is the truth, and proclaim that it is 100% certain, it is 100% fact, people believe you. And inherently, I think they would. That's, I think, a little bit of human nature. When somebody in a high level of authority, like somebody like a Dr. Anthony Fauci in the early days of COVID, proclaims this stuff, people listen. People have some level of trust until that trust can no longer be certain, until that trust can no longer be verified. And it wasn't long. I would argue just a few months into the moving of the goalposts, 2 weeks to slow or stop the spread, wear a mask, social distance, this, that, and the other, and COVID stops. It didn't stop. It was nowhere near as deadly as many of the fearmongers like Anthony Fauci made it out to be. But all of these proclamations that he was making had a significant impact on how we lived our lives for years. The things that he was saying, the decisions that he was making, the recommendations that he was putting forward, allegedly based on science, were not. The reason we're talking about this today is part of this diary that is continually being gone through by individuals shows that then Democrat Governor Roy Cooper was getting advice from Dr. Anthony Fauci, which is not an issue, but was not telling the public. So here are the details. These newly released records are raising questions about how Governor Roy Cooper handled his decision as it related to school closures across the state of North Carolina. We go all the way back. We flash you back to July the 1st, 2020. That is when the then Democrat governor was expected and told people that he was going to lay out a plan for parents, teachers, and school districts in North Carolina, how they would reopen for the fall semester, which would kick off in the month of August, the 2020-2021 school year. Instead, during that July the 1st, 2020 press conference, he delayed the decision. He did not offer an explanation for the delay, but said that the delay was here. Don't take my word for it. Here is the governor himself, July the 1st, 2020, at the North Carolina Emergency Management Center in Raleigh, talking about these schools.
Let me be clear. We want our schools open for in-person instruction in August. The classroom is the best place for children to learn. Recent reports recommend it, and I know many parents and children agree with this. School is where children learn academics, but it's also how they build their social skills, get reliable meals, stay physically fit, and really become tomorrow's leaders. We're not issuing a statewide directive today on how schools should open in the fall, but we will soon. We want to get our students back in the classroom, and we want to make sure that we get this right. My number one opening priority is classroom doors. So we encourage our public schools to continue that planning with a special focus on how teachers, staff, and students can best be protected.
So that's the governor. That is a press conference, July the 1st, 2020, where you just heard a couple seconds there from the governor talking about how this is his number one priority, which it was not. But this was my number one priority. We got to get kids back in the classroom, so on and so forth. During this this COVID-19 press briefing that took place, at no point did the governor mention that he had been in conversation with Dr. Anthony Fauci. Again, him communicating with Fauci makes a whole lot of sense. At the time, Fauci was and would go on for months more to be the leading guy as it relates to COVID-19. Even though a lot of what he was saying was total nonsense, he was still the leading guy for all intents and purposes. I would argue, in terms of full transparency, that the governor had an obligation to tell the people of North Carolina, tell the more than 1.5 million members of the North Carolina public school system, the more than 1.5 million children that attend public schools in North Carolina, that he had a conversation with the leader of the COVID-19 response here in the United States. He didn't do so. But according to Fauci's private diary, Cooper called him on June the 29th, 2020, to talk about reopening schools, just 2 days before this July the 1st press conference. This is what Fauci wrote in his diary. Governor Ray Cooper, presumably he was trying to refer to Roy Cooper, not the first time that our good friend, former Governor Roy Cooper, has been referred to by Ray. Hillary Clinton did the same thing. Governor Ray Cooper called me and spoke for 45 minutes on his dilemma, Fauci wrote. He was agonizing since he wanted to do the right thing. Since this is the first decision among governors regarding opening for the fall term, he feels that he will be an example. I recommended that he delay his decision for 2 weeks. That is the problem that exists here. Not that Cooper talked to Fauci, not that Cooper was talking to people across government to try and figure out the path forward, but that the American people, the citizens of North Carolina, were not informed of this decision. Why is this relevant? Because I think it was absolutely appropriate for North Carolinians to be able to ask that question and say, well, why you're delaying this decision? Why? You told us that you would have a guideline, a framework, a situation ready to go for July the 1st, 2020, so you could give guidance to school systems, give guidance to parents, give guidance to boards of education and teachers and everybody else involved in this very large public education process. I think it is only realistic to say, well, then we should have known that this discussion took place. We should have known that the recommendation from the good doctor and Anthony Fauci was to delay his decision by 2 weeks. Why? Because it's incredibly relevant. The governor, according to Fauci's diary, was agonizing with the decision. He felt that he would be the example for what other governors did. And so with all of that being the case, why were the citizens of North Carolina and the families of North Carolina that were waiting to figure out what is this school year going to look like, why was this information not provided? It is a total lack of transparency from former Democrat Governor Roy Cooper. That's it. It's a total lack of transparency. And now we can look back on this 6+ years later and go, what the hell were we doing? That is the reality of this situation. Is this a political bombshell? No, I don't think so. But as Roy Cooper looks to advance to the United States Senate coming up later on this year, I would like to think that somebody in that position would be capable of making decisions and be capable of being transparent with his or her constituents as to how those decisions are being made. I don't know. maybe I'm the conspiracy theorist in all of this. We'll get to more detail on this coming up here in just a couple of minutes. But before that, I want to tell you about the law group here in Wilmington and remind you that when legal challenges arise, make sure you put your trust in the law group. Since 2003, their experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across the eastern half of our state. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong defense, no matter the issue, the law group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures your questions are answered and issues are resolved as quickly as possible. Great news, ladies and gentlemen. They're located in downtown Wilmington and just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. That's 910-251-6088, or online at lawgroupnc.com. It's the Law Group. Experience and dedication you can rely on. We appreciate the law group and their continued support here of the Nick Craig Show. Quick break, more from Roy Cooper and Dr. Anthony Fauci on the other side as the Nick Craig Show continues on this Thursday morning, streaming live, YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. And a good Thursday to you. Welcome back to the Nick Craig Show as we continue some new reporting here in North Carolina, some 6.5 years later, as it relates to decisions to keep North Carolina's public schools closed. Those decisions made by the time at the time then Governor, a Democrat, Roy Cooper. If that name sounds familiar, well, of course it does. He is running to be the next senator from the state of North Carolina, and some very interesting reports out of Anthony Fauci's private diary that he kept during a COVID-19, in which he claims he had a conversation, with Governor Ray Cooper, as he refers to him, 2 days prior to a July the 1st, 2020 press conference in which he recommended to Cooper to delay his decision on reopening schools for 2 weeks. Now, in Fauci's diary, he does not list the reason as to why he recommended this decision to be delayed for 2 weeks. And this is really what has come to light, part of this over the last couple of years with Fauci, is how are these decisions being made? You tell somebody, hey, delay your decision. A very important decision, I'll note. North Carolina at the time had more than 1.5 million students enrolled in the public school system. I think it is very relevant to ask and demand, why are you making said decision? Anthony Fauci, the great doctor that he is and was, told Roy Cooper, hey, wait 14 days on this. Delay this thing by 2 weeks. What was the basis for that delay? Did he give a reason? We don't know. Fauci didn't write it in his diary, and during that July the 1st, 2020 press conference, Roy Cooper, A, didn't even mention he's spoken to Fauci at all, and B, gave no information to shine any sort of light for the citizens of North Carolina as to what was the basis for said decision. You just heard, we just listened to the press conference. Fortunately, all of this stuff is archived online. You can go back and listen. You can go back and watch. I'll admit it'll make your blood boil as I scrub through a bunch of COVID-19 press conferences doing some show prep for this. But all of this stuff is archived. All of this stuff is out there. And frankly, there was a huge lack of transparency as it relates to the decisions that were being made. Why was that the case? Well, we've learned in the years that have passed that Fauci was just making things up. He was just pulling things out of a hat, seemingly as it related to the advice, to the guidance that he was giving. Now, at the time, we didn't know that because he would proclaim that, oh, the scientists say, the scientific evidence says this, that, and the other. And if you don't agree with what I'm saying, if you question the things that are coming out of my mouth, you are denying the science. Do you remember what was said during that period of time? Do you remember the conversations that were taking place? I mean, you had family relationships that were ripped apart that still have not recovered because of this argument over trusting the quote unquote science. There was never any science. There was never any evidence. There was never any data to back up these decisions that were being made. It was a constant moving of the goalposts by an individual who proclaimed to be Mr. Science himself, Dr. Anthony Fauci. We just saw this exposed. His entire diary lays out that he had no freaking idea what was going on. And instead of being honest with the American people, instead of saying and being honest and transparent with them and saying, you know, guys, I'm going to level with you here. This is a completely unprecedented situation. We are doing our best to try and figure out what the right path forward is. I'm not going to stand up here and proclaim that this will 100% work, that will 100% work. But these are some of the things that we think could be. No, that none of that was there. This was all rock solid science. This was all rock solid peer-reviewed studies backed up by reams of data to back up these decisions that were being made. It was total nonsense. There wasn't any of that stuff. It never existed. And as the weeks turned into months and Americans started finding themselves ever more frustrated with the situation that was in front of them, they started calling it out. And when they were called it out, this so-called medical advice from people like Dr. Fauci, what were they called? Crazy radical right-wing conspiracy theorists, health deniers, science deniers, super spreaders. You're trying to kill grandma, trying to kill the entire population of the world because you don't want to sit home for months on end wearing a blue mask around because it's stopping the spread of COVID-19. That's what happened. That was the realistic response to some of these questions that were being asked. And I could see that being the case if this stuff was backed up by hard science and evidence. But it wasn't. It was never there. It never existed. This was nothing more than a power trip by Fauci. Nothing more than a power trip by entities within the United States federal government. I would argue other governments and other governing bodies and other organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, that had no better idea what to do than any regular everyday person. And again, that's fine. It's okay. As I mentioned at the open of the show, It's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay to say, this is uncharted territory. This is a pretty dynamic situation. This is a pretty uncertain thing. All of that is fine, but just be honest. I think the vast majority of the American people, and I can speak for myself on this, maybe some of you agree, maybe some of you disagree. If we were told honestly what was going on, if we were told honestly that many of the recommendations, the wearing of these masks, the 6 feet social distancing, the school closures, the business closures, if we were told, hey, we don't know exactly if this stuff is going to provide the results that we're hoping for, but hopefully it does. Hopefully it does this, and hopefully it does that. I think people would have had a little bit more grace. But when we were told, hey, if you just stay home for the next 2 weeks, COVID-19 goes away, which is essentially what we were told, that, of course, didn't happen. 2 weeks turned into 4 weeks. A month turned into 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, and then more than a year later, we look back and see a complete and total disaster unfolding in front of our very eyes. That's the legitimate situation that took place. That is what the entirety of the United States of America, and in large part the rest of the world, dealt with. Constant uncertainty, constant moving of the goalposts, all while individuals in high levels of government, somebody like a Dr. Anthony Fauci, who, by the way, was the highest paid federal employee during this period of time, was just spitballing stuff, was just making things up. The old adage of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. That's what went on day in and day out. Why? Well, and I think in large part, as we now know, due to Fauci's diary, he let all of the quote-unquote fame go to his head. He was more interested in being on the cover of magazines. He was more interested in being on national television night in and night out. He was interested in meeting celebrities. He raved about this in his diary. He was so excited to meet, Kim Kardashian. He couldn't believe that he got the opportunity to meet her. This is a guy that is leading the entirety of the United States down a path of how do we recover from a worldwide pandemic? And his interest was getting on television, being on the front page of magazines, and meeting celebrities that he idolized. It's a miserable situation to be in. And the scary part about it is that people were taking his advice. We now know, because of Fauci's diary, that Roy Cooper delayed the reopening of schools in the state of North Carolina based off of advice that he'd received in a private phone call with Anthony Fauci, circa early July 2020. Those decisions were made by Roy Cooper on the advice of Fauci, and the American people, the citizens of North Carolina, never had any idea that that was taking place. Had no insight at all as to why this decision was delayed and why schools remained closed in the state of North Carolina, which, of course, as we now know, contributed to unimaginable learning loss for an entire generation here in the state and across the rest of the country, right? There are real impacts to these decisions that were made. Real impacts that we are still seeing the lingering effects of today. Today. This stuff is still being felt, but we were trusting the advice of the quote-unquote good doctor when he was making said decisions. We are rounding out some new information from Dr. Anthony Fauci's private diary that indicates he had a phone call with then Governor Roy Cooper turned Senate candidate on June the 29th, 2020 to talk about reopening schools. Cooper would hold a press conference 2 days later where he promised he would give advice and give some sort of guidance for families, teachers, and school districts across the state of North Carolina. He, in fact, did not do so. That advice did not come during that July the 1st press conference. There was no public explanation at the time. When Cooper would then go on to announce his reopening framework on July the 14th, 2020, districts could operate under a hybrid model with reduced classroom capacity or choose entirely remote instruction. Because of advice, in large part, that likely came from Fauci, schools could not reopen normally at full capacity. which, as we now know, contributed to significant learning loss here in North Carolina. Students began the 2020-2021 school year without full-time classroom instruction because we were told, of course, that COVID was, that young people were going to get COVID. Students were talking about 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds were going to get COVID and they were going to die and they were going to bring COVID home and everybody was going to die. None of that was ever backed up. The mortality rate amongst teenagers and young people was very low, incredibly low. It was just all made up. It was all spitballing. It was all vibing for Anthony Fauci and for the individuals making these decisions. I mean, it is remarkable, truly, when you zoom all the way out and take a full look at the entirety of what was COVID and the entire picture. It is a remarkable situation that we were able to be controlled as a human race by individuals that, frankly, had absolutely no freaking idea what they were talking about. Had no, I mean, I could have stood up on the stage stood up at these press briefings every night during COVID and just made things up as well. And the results probably would have been, in large part, the same because none of this stuff had any sort of scientific grounding or basis. Just totally manufactured. Just totally made up. And because the American people weren't told of that information, because that level of transparency did not exist, well, people, for a large part, followed a lot of this so-called advice, right? Because I'm not a doctor, right? I don't want to kill Graham. I don't want my children to die of COVID-19. So yeah, let's keep them home. Let's sit a 7-year-old in front of a Zoom screen for months on end and see what happens with their education. Yeah, let's give that a shot. Regardless from individuals that actually had information to back up the fact that learning loss would be significant, that young individuals don't learn well sitting in front of a computer screen. All of that was known. There had been, even prior to COVID, actual studies and actual information to back that stuff up. But Democrats like Roy Cooper, Democrats here in North Carolina, fought tooth and nail to make sure children didn't get back in the classroom. North Carolina was one of the last states, or one of the later states, to allow and implement full in-person learning. And just another little reminder as the Senate race picks up here in North Carolina. In early 2021, March and April of 2021, the North Carolina General Assembly passed multiple pieces of legislation to try and force the governor to reopen schools. The governor at the time, Roy Cooper, vetoed multiple pieces of legislation that would have allowed schools to reopen. There are articles, again, the great thing about when this happened in 2020 is that the internet was already well in a full swing. It's not new technology at this point. All of these articles still exist. All of these schools, or all of these reports, still exist. I'll read you this one. This is published March 1st, 2021 over at Carolina Journal. The North Carolina General Assembly on Monday, March 1st, tried but failed by one vote, 29-20, to override the governor's veto of a bill to reopen schools, even as students' parents suffer. And opinion polls show that residents want children back in the classroom. Directly from this article, Cooper's veto of Senate Bill 37 came about 10 minutes before 5 p.m. on Friday, February the 26th. The General Assembly immediately vowed to override the move, initially indicating a number of Democratic legislators would break ranks and vote in favor of at least a partial in-person learning for children. But at least two of the lawmakers instead signaled on social media and through media outlets that they would side with the governor. This was what was going on. You had the Republican-led North Carolina General Assembly. You had parents and teachers groups and everybody else across the state of North Carolina saying, we want our kids back in the classroom. This is enough. By the way, this is March 2021. We are a full year past the beginning of COVID-19. And Roy Cooper and all of his wacko leftist friends, including the North Carolina Association of Educators, and the incredible left-wing ideology there of the state's largest teachers union, they wanted to keep the classrooms closed. They wanted to keep your children out of school. And they did, and they were successful in doing so up until the middle portion of March. when, after Cooper vetoed multiple pieces of legislation, finally came around and agreed with Republican lawmakers on March the 11th, 2021, to finally open schools here in North Carolina. That was the battle that was going on. Right? We're talking about a long period of time. COVID was not new in March of 2021. I think the vast majority of the American people by that point had fatigue as to what they were hearing. They knew that the school closures were nonsense. They knew that the risks weren't anywhere near as severe as were being proclaimed by people like Anthony Fauci. Their businesses had been wrecked by governments like Roy Cooper's here in North Carolina that shut down their businesses, were arresting individuals for going to gyms, going to churches. Just a disgusting display at the hands of government leaders, not only here in North Carolina, but across the rest of the United States. And the impacts, that's what really gets to me. The impacts were very well known and very well understood. You can't put young children in front of a Zoom screen and expect them to be proficient at grade level in reading, writing, and arithmetic. You cannot put young people in front of a Zoom screen and expect them to learn how to operate in society. One of the benefits of a school classroom is that you have to interact with other people. You learn social skills. You learn how to interact with your peers. There's a lot of things that go on that are not directly part of the education process that is very beneficial. I would argue necessary for young minds to learn how to interact, how to deal with conflict, things of that nature. That was important stuff, but it was all ignored. It wasn't the consistent theory that was pushed by individuals like Anthony Fauci. So here we are 6 years later now. This information is just coming to light. The learning loss was extreme across the United States and here in North Carolina, where many of the metrics in reading, writing, and arithmetic are still not back to pre-pandemic levels. The 2019 school year, which was the last school year with a full year of in-person, quote-unquote, regular schooling. We're still trying to pick up the pieces. Wasn't just 2 or 3 years ago. We are in August of 2026. We are talking about decisions that were being made in the summer of 2020 that we are still feeling the impacts on. COVID was a complete and total disaster. We were lied to. We were not given the proper information. We had people like Roy Cooper and Anthony Fauci making decisions, not informing the people how those decisions were being made, and told, if you don't like this, if you decide you're going to revolt against this and do what you want to do anyway to provide for you and your family, guess what we're going to do? We're going to send the police out there and we're going to arrest you. That was the state of COVID-19. This is a very interesting report, and it shines some interesting lights on what was going on during that period of time during COVID-19. I'll throw the links to the articles on this over in the show notes at patreon.com/Nick Craig. So that's going to do it for a Thursday edition of the program. Thanks to the Law Group here in Wilmington for their continued support. Visit them online, lawgroupnc.com, or give them a call, 910-251-6088. The Nick Craig Show streams live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, available 24/7 in your favorite podcast apps, and heard weeknights, 9 to 10 p.m. on WBT Radio in Charlotte. Enjoy your Thursday. We'll do it again tomorrow morning right here on The Nick Craig Show.